Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
or possibly even good whatever. Let me think. Right, I should probably talk about the other 97 Things books. In fact, I didn't even know there were going to be some other ones. Nicely matched. There you go. Yeah, this one came out a few weeks ago. 97 Things Every Engineering Manager Should Know. I can't say anything about it. I haven't read it. But basically, O'Reilly have started the whole thing up again. So currently, in fact, yeah, just this morning I was finishing off edits. Well, I think there's more edits to do on 97 Things Every Java Programmer Should Know. But what we're going to cover today is, let's just pop this one into the group chat. Is Gerard Meszaros' 97 contribution to 97 Things, which is Write Tests for People. So it is the penultimate one. Yeah, there's only one of it. Yeah, Write Tests for People. Now, I managed to get Gerard down to 2 pages for this because Gerard, I know Gerard originally through the patents community, and he wrote this thing, X Unit Test Patterns, which is probably better understood as this thing. It's about 1,000 pages. No. Yeah, more like 900 pages, but who's counting? It's about 900. You can use it as a weapon. So if your colleagues don't agree with you on a point about unit testing, just use this. But I got him down to 2 pages for this. And one of the things I really enjoyed about Gerard's contribution, and I tend to quote it quite a lot, there's a few key points. And curiously enough, it picks up from something we were discussing yesterday, which is this idea of understanding the audience of a piece of code. So write tests for people. So I'll read the piece out and then I'll summarize a couple of observations, and feel free to ask questions during or as we're going. The chat window is quite a good way of doing that. Okay, so you're writing automated tests for some or all of your production code. Congratulations. You are writing your test before you write your code. Even better. Just doing this makes you one of the early adopters on the leading edge of software engineering practice. But are you writing good tests? And how can you tell? One way is to ask, who am I writing the tests for? If the answer is for me to save me the effort of fixing bugs, or for the compiler so they can be executed, then the odds are you aren't writing the best possible tests. So who should you be writing the tests for? For the person trying to understand your code. Good tests act as documentation for the code they are testing. They describe how the code works. For each usage scenario, the tests describe the context, the starting point or the preconditions that must be satisfied, illustrate how the software is invoked, or describe the expected results or postconditions to be verified. And different usage scenarios will have slightly different versions of each of these 3. The person trying to understand your code should be able to look at a few tests, and by comparing these parts of the tests in question, be able to see what causes the software to behave differently. Each test should clearly illustrate the cause and effect relationship among these parts. This implies that what isn't visible in the test is just as important as what is visible. Too much code in the test distracts the reader with unimportant trivia. Whenever possible, hide such trivia behind meaningful method calls. The extract method refactoring is your best friend. And make sure you give each test a meaningful name that describes a particular usage scenario, so the test reader doesn't have to reverse engineer each test to understand what the various scenarios are. Between them, the names of the test class and class methods should include at least the starting point and how the software is being invoked. This allows the test coverage to be verified via a quick scan of the method names. It can also be useful to include the expected results in the test method names, as long as this doesn't cause the names to be too long to see or read. It is also a good idea to test your tests. You can verify that they detect the errors you think they detect by inserting those errors into the production code, your own private copy, of course, that you'll throw away. Make sure they report errors in a helpful and meaningful way. You should also verify that your tests speak clearly to a person trying to understand your code. The only way to do this is to have someone who isn't familiar with your code read your tests and tell you what she learned. Listen carefully to what she says. If she didn't understand something clearly, it probably isn't because she isn't very bright. It is more likely you weren't very clear. And go ahead and reverse the roles by reading her tests. Okay, so there's a couple of things there which I think are kind of interesting. One of them is he emphasizes this idea of audience and readability. The other thing is he makes it a practical thing, which is actually do read the tests. Have somebody else read your tests. And basically, this becomes integral in code reviewing. And there's a really subtle point, which I think is, I often emphasize, there's a particular piece I quote normally. I often emphasize this particular bit where he says, oops, I keep getting that one. Who should you be writing the tests for? For the person trying to understand your code, by which he means your production code. He doesn't mean your test code. So there's this idea that sometimes we are writing tests for people who read test code, and we tend not to think of that as an audience, rather than thinking these tests are for somebody who wants to know the whole picture, the big picture. They want to know my code. So instead of treating the tests separately, we treat them as somewhat integral. And I've also found this is a useful way of considering reviewing. So companies that do code reviews, often they'll focus on the code. They won't review their tests. They won't review their config files. They won't review their scripts, but they'll focus on the production code. If they do review any of these other artifacts, so unit tests, for example, they will review the unit test, but they will do it separately from their code reviews. Whereas I found that it's much more useful to review these together, treat them as an extended whole. Your tests tell you where to start. And particularly, as Gerard highlights, there's a three-part rule. And that three aspects, there's a kind of a three-act play. In fact, for completely different reasons, on my desk this morning, I happen to have this book, Plot and Structure. So this is a book on writing stories, not user stories, but actual stories. I was looking for a quote from it because I'm involved in a couple of writing related activities. So I happen to have this on my desk this morning, and it's only just this moment I realized there is a point here. Think about it as a three-act play. And people know this three-act play very differently. As Gerard describes it, the way he describes a three-act play, he outlines it. He says, describe the context, starting point, or preconditions that must be satisfied. That's step one. Illustrate how the software is invoked. That's step two. And describe the expected results or postconditions to be verified. Now that's step three. If you look at these carefully, you'll realize that if you write unit tests or have looked around the unit test space, these sound kind of familiar. There's three steps. Arrange, act, assert. The three A's. That's the first, the second, and the third part. Now, am I still coming through? Yeah, sorry, I just got something from Zoom telling me my internet connection was unstable. The other thing is, if you're familiar with behavior-driven development, it's exactly the same three things there, given, when, then. These are all equivalent. They keep being reinvented. It's like there's a three-act play, a three-part to your test, if you like. Sometimes these get a little folded together, but you can still kind of tease them out. So I quite like this idea that he takes, that there is a kind of a sort of a journey or a point, and he links it to other ideas as well. But there's this very strong idea of communication, which I think is definitely missing in the way that many people approach testing. They don't perceive it as an act of communication. They perceive it as an act of verification, which is clearly part of the story, but there's kind of like, it's like we're missing the other half here. So that's kind of my initial thoughts on that. I just wondered if you have any thoughts or you have any questions.
Well, about using the tests as a way of understanding the code, I would be interested if you could give any real world examples, maybe open source projects where that would be demonstrated nicely?
That is a very good question. Because I haven't really, I'm going to admit, I haven't been looking a lot at open source repos recently. I haven't been looking at them with this in mind, because I know one or two of my clients definitely do this, partly because I've encouraged them to. But I'm just trying to think. I'm not sure. Otherwise, I would give you a URL if I could just immediately think off the top of my head. Yeah, I don't have an immediate answer to that one. I know they're out there, but at the moment, I couldn't just say, "Oh, it's this project you should go and look at." What languages do you use?
Kotlin or Java?
Okay, Kotlin. Yeah, because the Java stuff, particularly anybody using Java, anybody using JUnit 5. There is a good chance that they are doing more of this than they otherwise would, because with JUnit 5, there's actually a couple of features in JUnit 5 that are in there because of the way that I've encouraged people to write tests in this very descriptive style. And indeed, a couple of the examples in the documentation are actually taken from a couple of my examples. But so I suspect that people using JUnit 5 are more likely to be doing this than perhaps some other groups. But I could not immediately point a finger. Occasionally, people tweet at me, "Hey, somebody's using your style," or somebody's doing it in a particular way. But I guess another way of looking at it is find anybody who has been potentially influenced by Steve Freeman and Nat Price. Steve actually contributed to this book. Both Steve and Nat contribute to the 97 Things Every Java Programmer Should Know. And the reason I'm citing them is because they wrote the book Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. And they were also basically the kind of inventors of mock objects. They are amongst the people who invented mock objects. But that particular book, let me just link that here. A number of people have been influenced by that, and they use tests that I would consider to be written very much in this kind of style and this approach. So anybody who's been influenced by them will probably be doing the same thing. Let me just switch network here, see if that makes a difference to me. Any other questions or thoughts on this?
I really like Spock. I think that's the framework that best encapsulates this
yes.
attitude.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Now, Spock is not something I've used heavily, except to explore in terms of examples and reviewing with a couple of clients. But yeah, it fits very naturally with this idea of communication. One of the things I quite like about Spock is it makes data-driven testing very easy. In other words, it gets out of your way. And I think that's actually a job of a good framework, is to get out of your way. And it does that very easily in the way that you can actually feel that you're immediately talking about what is it that we are testing and why is it we are testing, and as opposed to what are the mechanics of what am I testing. So I think regardless of the language that you're using, it's actually quite good to go and look at some of the Spock documentation or other people's examples using Spock, even if you're not using Groovy or any JVM language, because the style will influence you. You'll walk away from that going like, okay, I can see it's a style of thinking, and you'll see how that works. You'll see how that works out. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
I can even elaborate. I've tried JUnit and find there's too little space for the descriptions, and I've tried Cucumber and it's all description, and Spock seems like the sweet spot.
Yeah, I mean with JUnit, I think with JUnit, okay, I'm just getting with JUnit, I think sometimes a little bit of it is certainly legacy, is the JUnit 4 aspect. And so JUnit 4, it's, hang on. Yeah, JUnit 4 is not perhaps as good these days as we would like to think of it. Whereas JUnit 5, I think, is actually pretty good. It's quite lightweight. But I think Cucumber answers a different question. It solves a different problem, because you have to write quite a lot of extra stuff to get that to work. In other words, as a developer, you end up writing certainly a lot more code than you otherwise would. And if you're trying to do simple integration tests, Cucumber is going to get in your way. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking around. No matter what testing framework you end up using, you may not have a choice sometimes. No matter what testing framework you end up using, I've found very much you can learn from the way that other frameworks express themselves. Any other thoughts or questions on that?
Well, hi.
Hi.
Pernille from Danske Bank, lead developer there, where we're actually trying to do the test first approach, but it's very difficult for the developers actually to do the test first. It makes sense when we try to do the BDD and for our acceptance testing, where you actually do the test together with the users. But when it comes to unit testing, it's a completely different scenario, because then they will just do the test afterwards, because then we have done the test, and it's very hard for them to actually get the mind of doing the test first. Any thoughts about that?
I think that's an interesting one, because for me, the way I tend to look at testing technique is there's a number of different challenges. The first one is, are we writing tests at all? That's always the first question, because if that's not happening, then anything that you can do to change that is always good. Then there's the question of how much are we writing tests? Then comes the question of, when are we writing the tests? Are we writing things at the end, at the beginning? Are we writing them interleaved? And I think mostly, although I strongly advocate a test first style, for me the most important thing is, what do we leave behind in terms of what do we read? You can use TDD and a very strong test first approach and still end up with bad tests if you're not careful. The point is, what is the next person going to read? So that becomes the next thing, and I tend to refer to these as GUTS, good unit tests, borrowing a term from Alistair Cockburn. But the real challenge is trying to make the testing more continuous, and that's the issue. That is when we talk about test after, how far after are we writing the tests? That becomes the question. And if you like, there's a progression over time that we've progressively made more things. We start using the word continuous a lot these days. Started with continuous integration. We talk about continuous deployment, and now people talk about continuous everything. Continuous attention. And so there's this idea of continuous testing. In fact, there was an older version, an extension to JUnit called JUnit Max many years ago, from Kent Beck, that did continuous testing in the background. In other words, just as you have we have environments that have incremental compilation, you basically had this kind of incremental testing. The tests were always running. So you always had an indicator, red or green. And of course, as you start typing, you're going to get syntax errors, which means it doesn't compile, which means the test don't pass. So you ended up with a constant feedback cycle. And that idea I've not seen revisited very much, which is a shame, because I think there was something there. But that kind of idea of making it, whether you do it specifically first, write a test and then a piece of code, then a test, then a piece of code, is perhaps less important than the idea of getting them continuous. The idea that within the day, when somebody says, what did you do this morning? Did you write tests or did you write code? You say yes. In other words, everything is interleaved, so that you don't end up, today is a test writing day, tomorrow is a code writing day. So really it's bringing them closer together. And if you're starting from the position, this week we write the code, next week we write the tests, then the thing you want to do that is, well, let's do that on over a matter of days rather than weeks. And then if it's days, can we bring it to hours, or morning or afternoon? So it's looking at it from that point of view. And that may help people. Once you start making it continuous, it starts mattering a little bit less whether or not you choose to test first or test second. Now, that said, tomorrow's book club, we're going to look at a thing on pair programming. And the reason that is interestingly related is because of the idea of using tests as examples. Because sometimes if you're discussing something, it's a case of, well, hang on, do you mean this? And this is a very common idea, the idea of example-driven testing. But it's also a technique about that reframing of vocabulary is something I saw Dan North talking about a while back, where he said, if it's not good to use the word test in your environment, then try using another word. So instead of saying, I'm going to write a test, say, I'm going to write an example. Just change the words ever so slightly. But sometimes that's the idea, is that when you're talking to somebody, it's harder when you're doing it yourself, unless you've made it a personal discipline. But sometimes if you're in a pair or a mob, or just even actually in code reviews, again, that's a wonderful opportunity for adding new code. I think people don't look at code reviews the way that they might, or to get the most out of them. The idea is it's a conversation, and somebody may say, instead of just making recommendations, hang on, what about this example code? How would this work against your code? And actually creating code there and then, and actually treating it as much more interactive. So for me, the way to shift people to a more test first style is almost to not shift them to a test first style, is to really just to invite them to think of it more continuously, and to consider all these activities are connected. I'm going to show you an example. Well, all I need to do is add a couple of assertions on the end, and it's suddenly a test case. But why don't we do that now rather than scheduling it for later? And we haven't written the code for it, but that's fine. So it's a little bit of that. I think that certainly is the way I would think about it. Make it much more continuous along with everything else.
It makes sense, totally.
Cool. Any other kind of thoughts or questions?
Just a thought about the testing thing.
Yeah.
I learned from experience that my code quality improved a lot when I started thinking not test first, but as a part of developing, that you don't test our code. Testing is part of the code actually. So sometimes when you think about what the code is being used for, you end up with more clean code, more rules that you work from, and not as many exceptions that you would when you all of a sudden have these afterthoughts saying, oh, it needs to have this, it needs to have this. But when you think about the examples, as you say yourself, and also how to test this first, then a lot of these things that you will struggle with later, you have them up front where it's easier and doesn't cost as much as it would if you found it further down the line.
Yeah. No, it's good observations. Yeah. Definitely. I think that's the other thing is, as you're relating it, I think something else that I think is quite useful and kind of also ties in with Pernilla's point is that I think we go through life collecting a lot of experiences, but we're not necessarily very good at sharing them. And so there's this idea of having that feedback loop as you work with, as what's your experience of stuff, how can you pass that on? So I think there's this idea, this curious idea. In fact, this allows me to make another point, which is, until relatively recently, I found that there was a disconnect between how people would talk about their code and how they would talk their production code and how they would talk about their test code. And if I look across my bookshelf and I think back to everything that I've ever read, there's a lot of things on here's how to write this kind of code cleanly or efficiently or whatever. And then the advice on testing is minimal. And so when it comes to actually trying to write test code, it turns out that people aren't talking about it. The very first company I ever worked at after university, I was a Fortran programmer. So that kind of dates me a bit, but I was a Fortran programmer. And in the kitchen, when you're making a coffee, you'd often end up talking about coding style, or, you know, do you use this feature, or how do you do that? And I noticed this over the years, but nobody ever talks about tests. Is they're like they're not part of the shared conversation. They're kind of a private thing. And this was made very clear to me when a friend of mine who was a professor, computer science professor, we were having an email exchange about doing some design patterns teaching in his course. And he sent me some code examples. And then he sent me the next email. He said, oh, yes, and of course we should write tests. So he sent me the tests. And the tests were, I mean, not too fine a point, the tests were terrible. His code was great. His production code was brilliant. But the tests were something that were never shared. And it's like he'd never talked to anybody else about it. And I realized at that point, no, we never, until relatively recently, people don't share this discussion. What does a good test look like? And should other people be reading our tests? And so there's this kind of idea of turning the whole thing upside down and saying, actually, maybe your tests are the first thing you should read. And then your production code is the second thing you should read. So when introducing somebody to a new code base, or new to them code base, perhaps that's the way we should take it. Hey, here's the, look, let's walk from the tests into the code, rather than here's the code and let me show you where all the code is in the repo. Let me show you from the outside, because the tests reflect usage. So if we think of it from that point of view, here is how to use this thing. And if we think about it in terms of everyday devices, that we do this all the time. You know, when you're taught how to drive, you don't go and open up the car bonnet and go and look at the engine first of all. You typically start the car and you do the basic things that are about usage of the vehicle, not about how the vehicle is constructed or maintained. And so when we come to understand something complex, such as a code base, there's a lot of things that can help us. And the idea that perhaps tests can form part of the documentation model, as it were, and that we introduce people from that point of view, I think that's quite a helpful way of looking at it. Any other thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, so like I work with Python, and me and my colleagues do a lot with Jupyter, which became really popular.
Okay.
Although Jupyter is not a really test-friendly framework. How do you look at that development, and what kind of improvements could we include in that process?
Oh, that's a really good question, to which I do not have all the answers. I mean, I'm not an active Jupyter user. I think it's a really it doesn't fit what I'm doing, but it's it's a fascinating environment. But I've not really tried testing in it. Although I work with Python, and I generally end up recommending things like PyTest in preference to something like unit test. But I've not got a lot of experience, or indeed any experience, of working with Jupyter and trying to take a much deeper testing approach. So that's something I'd be interested in answers to if anybody else has them, but it's not something I feel I have any good insight into yet. But that's a general point, by the way. You know, getting people into it is this idea of integrated environment. That's kind of, you know, not integrated development environments, but actually integrated, immersive, contextual, deep, rich environments. I think that's kind of one of those things that they've come from one community, but they've not necessarily looked at it from a testing point of view. They've solved a different problem. So, I think there's a lot of the future is in that direction. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry.
No. I wanted to go something out of the tooling or about general scope, how we do testing. Like you can really good explain that examples are really good approach to understand how to, because the matter is, as you said, usage of the code. In order to understand the usage, you need to understand the bigger picture of the project what you work on and then you divide on a pieces, and then those pieces are the examples, which maybe you can get it from the customer, or maybe you can invent yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
So
and I
that's
think
the approach. How it means you need to understand also what you do first, not that you get some input and output and that's all.
Yeah, I mean, it helps you clarify things. It gives you the opportunity to focus. But sometimes this idea is that I think it's very easy for developers to try and take the largest thing and generalize, whereas really the challenge is sometimes to take the smallest thing and start from there. And that's true of any requirements, but it's also true, if you look at frameworks, for example, they are incredibly powerful. How do you understand a framework? Well, typically people want to have it doesn't matter if somebody tells you this framework can do anything, and here is a function that takes 20 arguments and it can do anything. The point is that doesn't tell you how to use it. That's why.
But framework has a model. Then we can speak about that model of the framework, of that functionality of the framework, and then we can have the usage of that one, and then we can think of example, and then we can go deep in that direction.
But I'm going to say it also works the other way.
Also,
yeah, it works the other way. In other words, what is the example that I'm trying to solve? So for me, a lot of learning, and whether it's learning how a framework works, is an iterative process, and you are iterating between, I have a mental model and I have a specific example, and I have a mental model and I have a specific example. So you bounce these off one another. So there's a danger sometimes developers say, I have the model, and they try and throw it all into the code. And now I don't know how to use it. It's got a lot of generalization and cases that I don't really understand, and we're not even sure we need them. So you sometimes need to come back down to earth and say, and here is an example. And what you're doing is you are literally testing your tests, and you're testing your code, but you're not testing it from the point of view of red, green. You're testing it to find out, what do I need from it? How easy is it to write that code? I worked with I developed something a few years ago where I actually threw out the code I was working with in the team that I was in, because we had come up with an idea, and I'd said, I think that's too complex. And somebody said, oh yeah, but we don't want to learn a new idea for traversing this data structure. Let's use the old ways. And I started writing tests against it. And I eventually said, this design is just too hard to use. For anybody to use this in their code, they're going to end up doing a lot of copy and paste. They're going to be writing for loops everywhere. It's just going to be, we need to abstract. So I turned it around and said, right, let's use the test to help drive how our usage. Let's find out how we want to use stuff. So here's an example. I would like to write code like this, not like this. So if I write code like that, what does that mean? So in other words, what you do is you work out what the API is by trying to use it. The idea is, what would I like to do? So for me, these two exist. There's a mental model, which may be quite complex and sophisticated, but there's also the reality of the test. This is example code. What does it look like? And there's a feedback cycle there. So for me, that's again, it goes back to the point about continuousness. You don't leave it too long before you try and use it. So sometimes you try and say, I want to use it like this, and then you build it, and then you build it and say, and how would I use that? And could I make that better? So there's a constant cycle there. In fact, I think on Monday did I refer to the design of everyday things? I might have done. A classic book on usability and everyday objects, not about software at all. But I found that was it was another online thing. Design of Everyday Things. That is a really interesting book because it makes you think in terms of usage, rather than usage and practicality. What is this useful? Can I use it easily? Although that does touch on what we talked about on Monday. But there's that idea of like, always try and anchor yourself in the usage. If you leave it too long from mental model to actually trying to use it, you'll find that you end up with it's not so much technical debt, but usage debt or something, a quality debt. So I tend to look at tests as being a reality check there. Okay, right, I think that is probably good for today. Let me just, as I mentioned, let me just put the link up for tomorrow. And that's on pair programming. Yes, I hope to see you tomorrow, and I'll find out what was happening with my connection. I have a feeling it might be to do with my family.
And
my
me
family
with mine.
Yeah.
I just want to mention one thing quickly. So Kevlin Henney is giving a master class as well. I'll just pop it in to the chat so y'all have it if you're in when you're interested. So for those who've been here a few times, please just log in with the same URL. Then I don't have to write you another email and you don't have to get back on. And so, yeah. Thank you very much, Kevlin. Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Last question.
Oh, yes.
It also mentions about something about the channel in the Slack. Are we using this? Or?
I am
Yes.
using that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super.
It is. It's quite. So, as a guideline, what I tend to do, because Zoom presents everything by default on the same screen. I've got a second screen running, and I keep that window open, the chat window open. Otherwise,
Okay.
I tend to find I miss the notifications completely. But if it moves, I see it. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Thank you, guys.
See you tomorrow. Have a good day.
Wonderful. See you tomorrow. Ciao.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.